Good evening, gang. Welcome to my thinking place. A bit of a change of venue for this video. I'm kind of sitting out in my private space for a bit, just kind of working some things through. And I thought perhaps in the midst of that I could throw you some thoughts in regards to how we might overcome and grow past those big events and those things that build up sometimes slowly in our lives that seem to impair us and hold us back. Those things that seem so large that we can't ever quite forget or overcome them. So, as I sit here, I'll ask you to excuse the production value. I don't suppose there's too many of you that are here for that, so just join me as I sit and kind of contemplate these things and offer you my thoughts. So, who am I, again, to talk about such things? I guess I'm just a guy that's been through some interesting and hard things and had to work these things through for myself, and I have found a way of freedom, a way of hope, and I want to promise you something here, and that is that there is hope, that these things don't need to rule over you, that you don't need to let them define you. They may always and should probably always affect your perception, but they need not define you nor constrain you. So, let me give you some context for these thoughts. This morning I was down visiting a very dear friend of mine. You know, as sometimes you can have those dear friends who are not always super intimate, but this fellow and I have been through, well, he was there for most of my military career. We were platoon commanders together, went to Afghanistan together. We have always kind of kept in touch a little bit over the years, and he's always been an encouragement to me. I was thought kind of a mentor to me as I was a young officer, and he very much embodied for me what an officer ought to be, and I respect him enormously. He retired about the same time I did last summer, although he put a lot more years into it, having come up a different way and coming through the ranks and having worked his way up there. He came across and then served with tremendous aptitude and grace and humanity as an officer. And so as I was visiting him this morning, and he was not doing very well. I mean, he's in the midst of a pretty significant illness. Just going down to visit him and try to encourage him. And, you know, his son was there, and he introduced us and had mentioned that we had done such and such together, and, you know, so on and so forth. And his son had commented on the Afghanistan mention that was kind of the tour that you really seemed to change a bit after you came back. And, you know, Larry's comments were, well, yeah. And I said, I think it would be really foolish to imagine that it wouldn't change you. You know, that an experience like that, where you are in the midst of life and death situations day in and day out, where you are making decisions that will end in other people dying, you know, and where you are trying to save life and not always succeeding, and you are losing friends and facing your mortality day in and day out, that should change you. If it doesn't, then there's probably something wrong there. You know, if we were to send someone off to university and they spent 4 years in a place that is supposed to teach critical thinking and give you a greater ability to interact with the world critically, and you came out exactly the same as you had gone in after those 4 years of education and challenging of your thought, then there's something wrong with the university, or there's something wrong with you. Like, you failed to acquire that which the university is supposed to give you. And if if you were to look at my Facebook profile, I somewhat ironically put in as the university that I went to, the School of Hard Knocks. Of course, I went to the Royal Military College of Canada. I got a degree in military strategic studies and yada yada. I've also gone to seminary and got a degree in pastoral education. So those are educations, but where I have learned far more in many ways is in dealing with people in some of the most desperate and hard situations that a person can be in. It is a school. So I would encourage you that if you have experienced things in your life that have fundamentally altered your perception of the world, that's a good thing. You shouldn't expect that you could experience something very hard and not be changed by it. But Larry was also right to respond by saying that, yeah, but a lot of us didn't come back quite right, did we? And some of us have gone, paraphrasing there, but in the essence of what he's saying, yeah, we lost quite a few guys since we've come back who have either died by their own hands or by overdose or whatever. You could say they died of despair, hopelessness, and many of those who haven't done that or gone there, that they still live daily almost in a cage that has been created inside of them, and they mitigate some of the hurt with medication, but they are almost lost to themselves. And I guess then the question for tonight is, how do you be the one who comes out changed but not broken, as opposed to the one who is chained by that experience and enslaved by it and owned by it? And, I realize I have a mixed audience here. Not everyone here is a Christian, and I'm glad. Really, I set this up to talk to those who were looking for something more than I was setting it up for those who are already, I think, satisfied in their religious pursuit. But being a Christian doesn't mean that you don't struggle with this very same problem and you don't feel this tremendous burden on your back from past mistakes, past sins, you might say, and that you don't necessarily feel burdened by past things that have been done to you that cause you to live in fear or anxiety or guilt. And it's a strange thing, but that's true, that even though someone else did the thing that was wrong, you might feel guilt almost because you were unable to stop it. That's a tragedy of being a human, I think. And so it's not as though being a Christian necessarily means that you have this sorted out, right? Like, it's not as though spirituality removes the human inclination to hold on to these things and let them into your heart as Lord and Master. And that's ultimately the problem. So we're talking about being enslaved by past experiences. You're letting it rule over you. And you need to look at it and say, this thing which happened to me, you need to ultimately look at it and say, it is not big enough to be my master, you know? And that's an oversimplification in the extreme, but um, I will give you a personal experience because I think this is really hard to describe without going into personal experience. So, yeah, um, I think different things affect different people, and it matters a lot what your worldview looks like when you go into a situation. I've talked a lot already in this channel about the tremendous importance of our integrity in our moral ethical framework that we build our life on, right? And the huge danger of having one that is not actually built to withstand the forces of the real world you live in. So, for some people, going into an environment like we were in Afghanistan, you might find just the very nature of conflict tremendously traumatic. Uh, Particularly, I think of one fellow I served with who was a fantastic soldier, a fantastic leader, and a fantastic killer of men. And the reason that he was so good, in my opinion, was that he was a deeply empathetic person who was a humanist, a secular humanist. Really, he had been involved in church life before, had rejected it, and had really gone into secular humanism. And he loved people. He believed that humans were basically good, and so he was also a very artistic man. He was a man who I think was much deeper than most people understood, having a tremendous love of art. He was a charcoal sketcher and, kind of like an amateur poet and a mosaicist and all of this stuff, and a student of humanity, a lover of humanity. And then that enabled him to really deeply understand his enemy, the Taliban, or, when we called them that. They were local fighters primarily. Uh, and a whole lot of different factions were involved in that thing, but that's neither here nor there. But he understood them well enough to get inside their heads and perceive how they would react to various things that we would do. And he used that very effectively to outthink and outmaneuver our enemies, and we routinely caught them flat-footed over and over again, really. And then afterwards, he would be quite broken by it. And I remember just watching him walk around with his shirt off, hands over his head, sometimes tears streaming down his cheeks afterwards, and it hurt him. For me, that wasn't the thing. I think I went there with a sense of human capacity for wrong. I went there really with a readiness to do what had to be done. I was not eager to kill. I had no desire to kill people, but when it did have to happen, I just took it as this was, we both came to this party, and you lost, man. It's not personal. I haven't really lost sleep over it. I'm not happy about it. It's not something that I'm excited about, but it had to happen, and I don't think that we were there in wrong motive, and so I'm content ultimately that they weren't more deserving of death, I might argue, than me per se, but they weren't on the right side, I felt, and still feel, So that wasn't it. But you know what really so I'll forgive you if you all unsubscribe me after I tell you this story, but here it is, guys. So I was an operations captain in that context. I ran the command post, and I was the guy who commanded the armored vehicles when we were out and about. planned with my boss a lot of the operations and generally, refining his plans because he was quite sharp about that stuff. But in any case, I basically worked the CP from 8 o'clock at night till 8 o'clock in the morning. And then I'd hand off to our company 2IC, go to ground for 4 hours, and then get up and try and catch up on other work. And it was a pretty insane schedule. I basically slept 4 hours a day for the whole 7 months I was there. But anyways, I woke up one morning and it was noon, and it was, you have to understand, we were mainly on hard rations at that point, bagged meals. But we would have, I think it was like once every 36 hours, we'd have a fresh meal. The cook would serve up, and it wasn't, I thought, time for that. But I woke up and I smelled this really pleasing aroma of roasted pork, and so I was like, "Oh, that's awesome!" My stomach's rumbling, and I got up and I walked through the curtain. Now, in my command post, we also had a local first aid point, trauma care point with a physician's assistant there, a warrant officer medic, and about 4 other medics. We would give medical care to locals in as much as we were able to, and the police, and so on and so forth. So as I stepped through the curtain that separated me from our little lobby in this little concrete building we'd taken over, uh, there were 3 kids there that had been burnt extremely badly, and all 3 of them ultimately died. The one closest to me was at least not moving at that point, and the other 2 were shaking in shock from third-degree burns over like 60+% of their bodies. And I looked down at this kid who was just staring into my eyes with this help me look. And of course, in the moment, this was fairly well into the tour, and kind of shut off your emotions. Just self preservation, I suppose. I just looked down at him, and I was like, huh. I looked over at my signaler, Master Corporal Baker, and said, well, I guess that's not lunch, eh? I laughed about it, stepped over these 3 dying kids, and went outside and lit my pipe. I remember my friend Chris McAdam at, sorry, yeah, names. I'll try to stop giving names, guys, but this makes you look good, Chris. So anyway, he just looked at me and said, Neil, what's wrong with you? He kind of snuck out on a convoy because he was the administrative officer, assistant adjutant back in CAF, and I think spent the night sleeping under a table. And anyways, he just showed up there, and we were friends, and he knew me, and he was like, that is not Neil to just laugh at a dying child and carry on. And so he's like, Neil, man, what's happening to you, dude? What's wrong with you? And I just looked at him and I was like, dude, this is just life, man. Get over it. And then we just carried on talking about stuff. But man, that lived with me. That lived with me. I love people. I have a compassionate heart by nature, I think, and it was a thing that just was like this weight on my back. Didn't happen right away. I came home. I didn't think anything of it. It didn't bubble to the surface right away. I never struggled with dreams about that or anything like that. I just kind of ignored it like it was just a thing that had happened and it was part of the whole thing. And in the moments, you're not thoughtful. But, and this might seem really trivial to some of you guys who are dealing with like major hurt from what people have done to you. But appreciate that it's a pretty big thing to to look at a child who is dying and who is begging you for sympathy, help, to salvation ultimately, and to just laugh at their, not even really at them, just laugh about them and step over them like they were, I don't know, bags of meat. And it took a couple of years, well, maybe maybe a year, that realization, I think, really hit me, and it really made me question who I was. Like what kind of a person are you that you could do that thing? It's it's a serious thing, and you make excuses for yourself. The circumstances, the psychological need to cut yourself off, but I don't know. I think if you have done this kind of thing, it doesn't. You can't rationalize that guilt away because it's. Your heart. You know that you you are a person capable of being that insensitive. And this comes back to what Jordan Peterson used to say a lot. He used to use the Auschwitz guard and say that until you realize that you actually have him inside of you, like a person who is capable of being an Auschwitz guard and being happy about that, like there's a part of you that's capable of doing that. And if you let him rule, he'll come in and he will, right? And that was it in me, if you will. Perhaps not quite the same extreme, but it's on the road, man. And so, you know, uh, where do you go with that? Where do you take that kind of a thing? Uh, you can psychologize it away. You can tell yourself it's not your fault, but ultimately you don't, on a spiritual level, recognize those equivocations. They don't work, man. Like you can say, nah, that wasn't me, but the guilt's there. It's just there, right? And yeah, it wasn't simple, man. It wasn't simple to work that through. I mean, part of it, I think, was just expanding my understanding of human nature to truly encompass myself. And this might be something, if you guys are interested in following up a little bit more in this line of thought, please make a comment to that effect or ask questions that are more specific. But at the end of the day, you have to recognize that the narrative that you have built around yourself is not who you really are. That we all, to a certain extent, idealize what we are by what we would like to be. And I think sometimes the revelation that that's not true is what we then struggle against. And I'm talking now about a thing that I did, a failing that I made. It probably doesn't apply exactly to you if what you're working through is that somebody hurt you very badly. But at the end of the day, it still works in this sense, which is that the thing that you are struggling against is that primarily you don't have the power to stop people from hurting you, and you have a narrative where you're in charge. You have a narrative where you are able to prevail over evil, and then you realize that you don't. That this is a contrast against your understanding of who you are and what you are. And so the big problem about that, by the way, is that if you have built a narrative where you are sovereign in your own life, where you have control over your outcomes, then that thing that was done to you was your fault because you let it happen. I'm not saying that's true. It's not true. Um, but if that's your personal narrative, then that's how you're going to perceive that thing, right? Even if it's just on an unconscious level, even if you intellectually know it wasn't your fault, you're still stuck in that place where you, as the boss, let that happen. So how do you deal with this? You know, how do you deal with I did this terrible thing that tells me that I'm able to do these kinds of terrible things. I'm not who I thought I was. This terrible thing was done to me, and I let it be done to me. What am I supposed to do about that? How am I supposed to not let that happen again? Well, change the foundation stones on your house. Honestly, that's the best I can offer you, is that you need to recognize that that is who you are, right? And that is what you are capable of or incapable of, right? You need to move your house into the place of reality that says, I have within me this capacity for evil, for harm to others. I have within me this incapacity to prevent harm to others or to myself. And once you embrace that reality, then what? Well, ultimately, I'm not saying it's an easy thing to do or that it's necessarily quick or immediate, but the only way out of that I know of, and it is freedom. I promise you, it's freedom if you pursue it. The only way out is to say, is to find that there is a God who sent his eternal self in the form of his Son, who was part of him and yet beloved by him, to die for you, who endured tremendous suffering and hardship when he ought to have been eternally in heaven. Like, this is the Christian truth. And he saw fit to do that, the Bible says, to his enemies, to those who hated him. See, this is what Christianity is. And I see a lot of stuff on these channels that are trying to explore Christianity, the Petersonian way of psychologizing it or philosophizing it and breaking it down, man. Yeah, I mean that can be a useful tool for you. I'm confident of that, but that's not what Christianity is, right? Christianity is not a tool you use. It's a tool that it is a mechanism by which you can be used by him. And you need to surrender that to him, right? Like, that's ultimately what it's about, is to say, Jesus loved me enough to forgive me. And if I read the Bible, it says he forgave me for all my sins, past, present, and future, when I accepted his forgiveness. Well, if he forgave me, then I can forgive me. Not because I deserve it, but because he does. It's a tremendous mind shift, guys. Like, you need to totally move your place from primacy into service. And by putting yourself into the position of a servant of God, then you're able to overcome that past tragedy because it is worthy service to him. And, and this is a fundamental change in the dynamic, because before you were struggling as a person who felt themselves unworthy of redemption, to redeem yourself for yourself. But you already know that you're unworthy of redemption. You believe that. So, how are you supposed to forgive or redeem yourself when you don't believe that you're worthy of it? But if what you're serving is a holy God who loves you enough to even descend from heaven, live as a man, and die for you, like, that's a tremendous thing. Like, what is he not worthy of? Well, if it's for him, he's worthy of me forgiving myself and surrendering this hurt at his feet. I am not worthy of that, and I know that. But he's worthy of that, so I'll do it for him. And it works. It's real, it's powerful, it's changing, it's healing, it's true real hope. It's eternal hope. And ultimately that is what you need to do, is to come to him and surrender this burden at his feet, because you will never be able to surrender it to yourself, because you will always know that you aren't worthy of that. And maybe you'll deceive yourself into forgetting it. I don't know. Like, maybe some people pull that off, and maybe I'm a kook, right? Sure, but I haven't I haven't encountered it yet. You know, I've found people who certainly convince themselves to serve something that is bigger than them, and that's quite effective. Like, if you can get into some other religious pursuit or some other ideological pursuit, and you can lay your sacrifices at the feet of, say, the regiment, the army. That does work. It's actually effective for at least until you realize how unworthy that thing that you laid it before is. Because the army, for example, doesn't care about you. Your country is not worthy of your sacrifice, truly. Um, your wife, your family, they aren't worthy of it. It's not a thing you do to love your family because they're worthy of it. It's a thing you do because God is worthy of it. But it's a sacrifice, right? Like, to love your family. It's a service, but your wife will fail you, or your husband will fail you just as much as you fail them. Your children certainly are not there for you to worship, because that's going to be catastrophic for probably both of you, all of you. God, though, the God who loved you enough to pay for you and buy you and say, I want you to be my family and my son. I want you to be like my son. It's a different thing, guys. So those are my thoughts for this evening. I'll leave you with them. Take care.